Right, everybody. So I am happy to introduce Andrew McNair, who is presenting a qualitative and quantitative analysis of automated speech recognition, or ASR, assisted transcription of Chickasaw. Andrew is a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation, federally recognized tribe located in South Central Oklahoma, the United States. He's currently a PhD student in linguistics with a concentration in language revitalization at the University of Arizona. Andrew previously completed his coursework for his MA in Native American Languages and Linguistics, which was a thesis program at the University of Arizona. His primary research focuses on the intersection of switch reference and discourse marking in Chickasaw. You say Chickasaw? Chikashshanompa. An area with almost no previous research discourse marking. The goal of his work is to inform the pedagogies of our adult second language immersion school, which just graduated its first cohort of conversational L2 speakers. Andrew is also a contractor with his tribe's language department, where he transcribes oral native narratives in Chickasaw and assists with translation of these narratives. He works with elder speakers and annotates corpus of language materials to help a community language and help a language community that is back home. Andrew's my colleague. We've been in classes together. We're friends. He's dear to me, and yeah, it's a pleasure to
Thank you so much, Shay. And just so I know every morning, so I have 30 minutes, right?
Yes.
Okay, I'll just also set a timer just so I get questions. Okay. Hopefully this is seamless. No? Oh, yeah, something. Maybe it takes a second. How do I do it?
Well, we're now down to 25. And the lesson here is as an Indigenous person, you shouldn't trust technology.
Yes. It works. Okay. Now it's in there. Good. Okay. Okay, it works. Thank you. All right. Sorry for that hiccup, everyone. What Shay said, my name is Andrew McNair, Chikashshaw. I'm Chickasaw. I'm from a tribe in the United States, what is the southern United States now in Oklahoma. So today I'm presenting qualitative and quantitative analysis of automated speech recognition in my language, Chikashshanompa. So just a quick description of who I am and what motivates this work, the whole reason that I'm here. So I'm a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation. We're a federally recognized tribe located in what is now the state of Oklahoma in south central United States. And we were originally from the southeastern United States, which I'll show you later in some context about our language and our community. But currently I'm a PhD student in linguistics with a concentration in language revitalization, as she mentioned. And at the University of Arizona, we are located on the traditional lands of the Tonopah and Pascagoula people, who I wanted to mention here. And yes, I'm a contractor for the Tribal Language Department. And hopefully, after my PhD, my coursework is done, and I defend my dissertation successfully, I'll be able to go back home and work full-time for the tribe. So just to give an overview of what I'll be talking about today, I just want to give an overview of the language and our community, and like I said, what motivates all this work, what is the need, why am I doing this. Also talking about what is this technology, ASR, how can Indigenous Indigenous community to use this technology in a responsible way, and to be careful about some pitfalls to look out for, as Ross sort of hinted at yesterday. Then we're going to talk about the model itself. Don't worry, we won't get too technical. I'm not a computational linguist. I just listen and hang out with a lot of them. So then I'm going to talk about the pilot study I did. And we're going to discuss the results and talk about some sort of quantitative and qualitative analysis. And then I'm going to give acknowledgements and some takeaway future steps. Actually, the acknowledgement slide, that might be a little out of order. I might have taken that out of the slide. I might be error. We'll see. So just to give some background, Chikashshanompa is spoken by around 2 dozen first language speakers who are all tribal elders. They all live in our reservation boundaries in south central Oklahoma. We've lost a number of speakers through the COVID pandemic, and I believe in the 1980s we had around 1,000 speakers, and today we only have 2 dozen, and actually a speaker passed away just a few weeks ago, so it's just a reminder of the really time-sensitive nature of this work. So there's a lot that contributed to the language situation that we're in today that I'm sure a lot of you can relate to. So there's a lot of parallels between what happened here in this country and in the United States. So we were forcibly removed from our homelands on the Trail of Tears. We, encountered oppressive language policies. We weren't allowed to speak our languages. Our elders were beaten. They were had mouths washed out with soap. They were sent to boarding schools. My great-grandfather went to a boarding school for Indigenous called Shalaka Indian Agricultural School. Many folks went as well. And there's been just centuries of prolonged assimilation, culturally, ethnically, intermarriage, religion, language policies, all of this. And so as you can imagine, this led to a massive interruption in intergenerational language transmission. So just to give some more context on this, I know in the United States, the Trail of Tears is a very, very well-known historical tragedy. I imagine some of you all might know about it here. I'm not sure internationally how well-known this is, but in 1837, we were the last of the so-called 5 tribes to be forcibly removed from our homelands. And if you look there in this, what is now the state of Mississippi, there's a purple line. So that is our community. And starting in 1837, we were marched westward to what was then called Indian Territory and what later became the state of Oklahoma. So I just wanted to give a more hopeful sort of estimation of our present situation. We've obviously faced a lot of adversity, but we've persevered and survived. We have a saying, which means we are still here. So today, we are in sort of what we call the Chickasaw Spring or Renaissance. So what we do in our language work is we're focused on sort of a 2-pronged approach, documentation and also revitalization. And these go hand in hand, and sometimes they have to be counterbalanced. So you have to use your time wisely with elders, but essentially an overview of what we're doing. We're able to provide free or low-cost language resources for tribal citizens to learn our language. So that includes a number of dictionaries, a pedagogical grammar, so essentially a textbook with audio recordings. We have several phone apps. We even have emojis, which is fun, with sort of like the emojis but with traditional markings and regalia, which is a good way to get people engaged. We also contracted with Rosetta Stone to provide 3 levels of that language learning program for our citizens, and a 4th is actually on the way, which is great. Let's see, we also have online classes, which was sort of my introduction actually to learning the language. I always wanted to learn online classes, but the first way that I was able to do that. More excitingly, I think, the second point, we have in-person and virtual adult immersion programs. And so this is what I think Shay mentioned in the introduction. We have the Chickasaw Academy Adult Immersion Program and the Chickasaw Academy Adult Immersion Virtual Program. In terms of the more documentation work that we do, and this is more the side that I am on, we document traditional narratives from elders. And that includes just traditional, we call them Chikashshanompa, which are animal stories, possum stories, which contain sort of moral tales or lessons or historical knowledge. We also look at childhood narratives from elders and cultural knowledge, even medicine. Those things are more sensitive, of course, and we have a very careful way of sort of siloing that data and protecting access to that, especially. which I will talk about later, which is important to the ASR. And finally, we have what's called a Chickasaw Language Committee, which consists of all of the first language speakers and I think 2 of the most proficient L2 speakers. And their main task is to create new words. So for like computer is Tolilopa, which means metal brain. Internet is Tolilopa, which means main metal brain. Different kind of analogy there. And so this is sort of like the bulk, the core of the stuff that we do on a day-to-day basis. Oh, I just wanted to show here a picture because I feel like it really enriches this sort of picture that I'm using. This is the first evolution cohort. We have Jason, we have Elias, we have Faithlin, we have Rick, the teacher, just a lot of great folks here. And these are all now conversationally proficient, advanced L2 speakers of the language. It's exciting. They're going on to teach their own immersion cohorts starting next year. Okay, so now turning to the specifics of what I'm talking about. Automated speech recognition, I think Ross sort of set this up nicely yesterday, so thank you. What is ASR? So in a nutshell, automated speech recognition uses statistical models trained on hours of audio recordings to generate transcripts of new recordings. And it's sort of a black box. It's not really necessarily clear what's happening inside of the model computationally, or perhaps to a much more clever person than I am, it is clear, but I just want to disclaim again that today we're not going to necessarily get into a lot of like highly technical coding and computing stuff. It's not really important for us to look at the results of this pilot study. But ASR is a very interesting technology, and we'll see this model that we're using just allowed us to work with Chickasaw. So first I just want to talk about how Indigenous communities can really use ASR and what are the pitfalls that we want to look out for. Because as Dr. Berry was hinting at yesterday, the question and answer period, technology is not the end-all be-all, and it's not going to save us. And we also have to watch out for big tech companies that might have ulterior motives in accessing data. We have to be very careful about that. So, but talking about how we want to use this, why would we do something like ASR? So the first motivation here is that we want to build what's called a corpus of fully transcribed and translated narratives in our language. Just to note, I put corpus in quotation marks. I don't know what other term to use. I really dislike that term because it's sort of like dead. And I think that our collection of text and narratives is very much alive. Corpus is an unfortunate word, but it's what we use in the field of linguistics, and maybe we can brainstorm on what else to call it. But transcription of recorded materials is a really significant bottleneck for tribal language departments. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of manpower and hours and effort. And also translating these recordings is also very time consuming, and it takes that time that we need to spend with elders that can be spent in many different ways. We want to be good stewards of that and also recognize that they have their own lives and they should be respected. They're not just sources of information, right? They are pillars of our community. So another thing that we want to use ASR for potentially is creating speech to text or text messaging. So this goes in line with sort of what Ross was mentioning with creating keyboards and more contemporary applications for younger speakers of Chickasaw that want to use this technology. Another interesting application is live captioning of speech for broadcast in Indigenous languages. So this example applies with Coto Solano actually, which was, I think, the first language that, or one of the first languages that this technology, this specific model was used with. And there are broadcasts there in Coto Solano, and the community had expressed interest in using this ASR to generate these transcripts for television. And I'm actually interested to talk to Rolanda to see what the stats of that looks like. As you can imagine, there's also many other applications of this. Okay, so talking about considerations here, this is probably not even all of them. This is a very important thing before we just put our data into the computer. We want to think about what we're doing with it and who has access to information. So obviously the paramount consideration is Indigenous data sovereignty. So who has access to this data? Who controls access to the data? Who has say over what happens to the data? And also what kind of narratives are being used to train the model? Are they culturally sensitive or not? Do they contain really protected traditional knowledge about medicine, for example, or spirituality? So as a side note here, when training this model, we specifically excluded narratives that dealt with very sensitive topics or personal issues from speakers. And we didn't want to put it, even though we believe the model is secure, we control access to this data. It's not something that we wanted to put into this model. That's just an important consideration to keep in mind. Also, we have to think about community buy-in and support for this technology. So, how do community members feel about it? You know, is it just something, just something that we find interesting, or is it something that the community as a whole would want to support? Also, responsible use cases for this. So, what are we even doing with this technology, right? In this case, it's a pretty limited use case at this moment. We are just trying to speed up transcription so that we can use our time more wisely and spend it with elders instead of sitting there typing, listening to recordings, you know. And also, what is the decision-making process around these? So every community has to come to their own conclusions there. And then finally, speaker and community attitude. So is this something that learners and speakers would even find useful? Okay, so with all that stated, let's get into the nitty-gritty of what I've looked at with Chickasaw and ASR. So the model that we are using, it has this really fancy name, XLSR-Wav2Vec2, and this is a model produced by Coto Solano and colleagues in 2022. It uses a popular automated speech recognition system or model called Day2, and it overlays that model with another cross-linguistic model with comparative audio from 4 different languages. You might be thinking, what's the point of that? The reason that it does that is to allow us to train the model with much fewer hours of audio than would be otherwise needed. So if you think of a language like English, there's probably billions of hours. I don't know, maybe that's too many, but there's so many hours of audio that you could train a model off of English. It's not a quote low resource language. But for many indigenous languages, we don't have that many hours of recordings. In our case, we have a pretty healthy corpus, but you know, that is a big barrier to being able to use automated speech recognition is if you don't have tons and tons and tons of data to put into this model. And that's why the cross-linguistic part is important. It sort of gives us a shortcut here. So in our case, we trained this model on 82.35 minutes. I don't know why I'm so specific with that. 82.35 minutes of Chikashshanompa audio, 1.37 hours from 13 different speakers, and we had a mix of male and female speakers because we didn't want it to just pull from one particular vocal register. And so we actually found that the model did pretty well with Chickasaw. We got, it appears alarming, but a word error rate of 80% on average. The reason it sounds alarming as it sounds is when we look at what's called the character error rate, it was only 20% or 21% specifically. So if any character in a word is wrong, that whole word is counted incorrectly. So the character error rate is really more illustrative here. But the word error rate, we can see that we actually are getting 80% of the characters in words correct, which is pretty impressive for only training this on 1.5 hours of audio. Okay, so what I wanted to do was, now that we have this model and we trained it, let's see if it's actually useful. It's not just, oh, this is so interesting, and I guess at a linguistics conference I could have just stopped there and said, okay, here's this model, it's interesting. But I wanted to say, is it actually useful? So what I did was design this pilot study along with my supervisor, Dr. Kimberly Johnson, and this was our experimental design. So we had 4 study participants, and that includes myself as one of these participants. All of us are tribal citizens and second language learners of our language, which is an important factor here. From this, we sorted into 2 cohorts, so experienced transcribers and less experienced or inexperienced transcribers. So today, I would consider myself an experienced transcriber. When I did this study last summer, I was pretty inexperienced, so I was in the the second category when we did this study. For the experiment itself, what we did was we selected 4 one-minute clips from 4 different speakers, and my boss created what are called gold standard transcriptions with which to compare the ASR-generated transcripts. And to keep this, because I was participating in the study, I didn't see these before I looked at the transcripts and participated in the study. We also sorted speakers into quote-unquote easy and difficult, which is a bit of a squishy category, right? We just sort of impressionistically gathered a sense of which speakers were easier to understand for second language learners who spoke perhaps more clearly and who spoke dialects of the language that were closer to the sort of grammatical textbook version. So those were the easier speakers, and then we had more difficult speakers. And then finally, we just asked participants to transcribe 2 clips, one easy and one hard, without using the ASR transcript, and 2 clips, one easy and one hard, with the ASR, I should have said, and to time themselves. So this is a lot. I know we'll walk through the results here and what we see. So this table, and I break this down on the next page, but it just shows you how long it took for each of these cohorts of transcribers and for each of these speakers. So 1 and 2 are, and I've ambiguated these so we don't have names attached, right? So 1 and 2 are the less experienced transcribers, 3 and 4 are the more experienced. And these speakers at the top, these initials, are elders whom these recordings came from, so Luther John, who's a dear elder who I work with a lot, Jerry Matachi, Stanley Smith, and Welcome Folsom. And we can see the times that it took these different transcribers to transcribe one minute of audio. Without ASR, it just as the initials, and with ASR, you can see it has the initials and the dashed ASR. Okay, so this is just a mess of data, right? So let's go to the next slide and look at how it actually breaks down. So we have very interesting results here, and I'll kind of explain on the next slide, but just to sort of present what we see here. I've sorted this into 4 sort of categories here. So low experienced transcribers doing easy recordings, high experienced transcribers also doing easy recordings, and then again low experienced transcribers doing hard recordings, and high experienced transcribers doing hard recordings. So without ASR, we can see that for the first 2 columns here with easy recordings, we see a massive assist using the ASR. So it took 24.11 minutes without ASR for the low experienced transcribers, and with ASR it only took 17.61 minutes. So it sped things up by 36.9%. Interestingly, with the high experienced transcribers, it had even more drastic of an impact. We see that it sped up transcription by 85.9%, which is a really significant improvement. Interestingly, and this is something we'll talk about as well in the next slide, for the harder recordings, it actually seemed to slow us down, but just a little bit. So for the low experienced transcribers, it slowed us down by 6.7%, not too much. And then for the more experienced, it slowed them down by about 20%. So let's talk about what all of this means. First of all, I just want to disclaim before we go through these points that this is not a super rigorous study. We don't have like a statistically significant, we don't have the ability to have statistically significant results because we have such a small sample size here. And that's just because we only have a handful of people who can transcribe the language. So just to give that disclaimer, this is not super scientific, it's just sort of impressionistic results here. But the main takeaway that we seem to have here is that speaker difficulty seems to have an impact on transcription speed. So this isn't entirely surprising. The speakers that are harder to understand, the ASR helps, maybe, but it actually seems like it kind of hurts when we look at the percentages because it actually took a little bit longer for people to work on those recordings using ASR. And my thoughts on this is possibly it's due to longer time spent spell checking, longer time spent listening back to the audio. There could be a number of factors here. Or perhaps the model itself is performing poorly here. It's also very possible that that's the case. With a larger sample size, we would probably know, but this is just sort of a guess. In terms of what we want to do with this model, though, and whether we want to use it, I think things to consider, and this is sort of a next step for us, is looking at what is the impact that this has on the transcribers themselves and their language learning process. Because as I mentioned, all the participants are tribal members and are really invested in learning language. There's a huge difference between listening to the words in your language and accessing that knowledge and writing it down. There's a big difference between that and getting a transcript from a model spit out and essentially being a human spell checker, right? And so that is a big consideration. Even if this helps us out, is that something that is that a trade-off we're willing to make, right? So that's something to consider. This sort of ties into this next point here about connection to the language. I personally will say that when I was correcting the ASR generated transcripts, I felt a lot less connected. I didn't feel like I was understanding the words that I was seeing as much as if I had just written it down, hearing it. And we also just need to consider what are the other potential utilities of ASR, and that's something further down the line if we even decide to use this for these purposes, but that's an important consideration as well. Okay, so sort of coming to the end, just sort of takeaways and future steps here. The next plan that I have for this work is to get community feedback on this, specifically starting with the qualitative survey, which unfortunately I was not able to get the results of before this presentation, but of the transcribers in this project, did they find it beneficial? Did they find that it alienated them from the language, or did they find it connected them closer? You know, perhaps there's a variety of opinions here. We also just need more transcribers. We need more folks who are able to do this kind of work, and that's something that we're working on, and that will come with time. And so we can pursue these future steps as we move forward and as we generate more speakers through our immersion programs. And finally, I would like to in the future do a sort of more quantitative analysis, you know, properly statistics and p-values and all that stuff. But looking at the speed and also the accuracy of ASR, because that's something that I didn't look at here, is the accuracy of the transcripts that were produced by the transcribers themselves compared to the gold standard. That's something that would be beneficial with a larger sample size. Okay, and that brings us to my references there. I just wanted to say Mokilla, that's all. And thank you to the McNair people for hosting us, and Dr. Greenmark for organizing the conference. And I think I wrapped up a bit early, so that works out. So I can go to questions now.
Andrew,
Yes.
with the data analysis, there's something that I didn't see.
Sure.
So you have minutes,
Yes.
but I don't know if we're talking about a passage, a single word. What's the length? What's the ratio? So if it takes, so for instance, if it takes a person 17 minutes to read whatever's on the page, and it takes 17 minutes to transcribe it, then it's a 1-to-1 ratio.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know what the ratio is with those minutes.
Sure, no, that's a great question, and I probably should have explained the terminal design a little bit clearer. So that the ratio is that 17 minutes in that example to 1 minute. So all of the audio clips were 1 minute long. So basically it took us like 17 minutes to transcribe 1 minute of audio.
And
Which gives you an indication of how much of a bottleneck this process is, because it takes 17 times as long to transcribe the thing than it is long.
And on average, if you have one, so for instance, if I'm reading a page, I know that if there's approximately 240 words on the page, it's going to take me 2.5 minutes to read that page. If I'm at a little bit faster than normal speech, about how much in that 1 minute is in the language, roughly, on average?
Sure. So if I understand your question correctly, so all of the 1 minute, so every sample that was used is all of Chickasaw.
That I understand.
Okay.
But about how many words in a minute?
Oh, I see what you're saying. I didn't do the word count. And also the notion of a word in Chickasaw is we have words that can be, this long.
Yeah.
It's like, it's not as illustrative as like English, but no, that's a good thought.
So, yeah, and I understand the thing with the words. So 1 minute, is that half a page in Chickasaw, a full page, just roughly?
I'm only used to seeing it in the transcription software we use called AILDI, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So I don't know how that translates to a page. I could look into that.
Yeah, it'd be interesting as far as the data. And it would be different.
How fast they're speaking could play into it.
Yeah.
Too. Yes.
But it provides like a control or a
Sure.
baseline,
Sure. No, that's a really good thought. I'll look into that. Sure.
I was curious just to hear you talk a little bit more about like what the delineation was for
4 speakers that we're going to use the audio from for this, and who would you say is the easiest of these and who is the hardest of these? So I think we did it that way. And what I guess more to expand on what we mean by easy and hard, right, is even from the voice, you know, some of the folks, I think Weldon, who was one of the most difficult speakers, he was in his 90s, I think, when the recording was made, and so his voice was a little tired and like creaky and difficult to perhaps understand. So that was a factor as well. But yeah, it honestly is one of the most, I guess you could say, mushy parts of this. Is we just had to make that determination.
Thank you very much. In terms of the material that's reassessed, has it previously been translated? Has the material been previously translated? In were there any significant changes to this process of diligently sitting, listening, and going through it? I'm not sure if you could answer that, but that's the question I might ask.
Sure, no, that's a great question. I think we decided to use all audio that had not been looked at before. It had not been transcribed or translated before. And
Sorry,
we just,
and then if you haven't, then what are the beautiful bits that have come out of it?
sure. That's a great question. I think, sorry, so you're asking what are the sort of positives that came out of that?
Positives, but is there things inside the material, inside the tapes that you had not anticipated?
Oh, yes. We, like in terms of the content itself, we found a lot of interesting stories and personal anecdotes. I know Luther is somebody who, and sadly he's the only of our elders there that's presently living, but he is just always telling a new story every time that you see him. So it definitely enriched our cultural knowledge as well. Thank you for that question.
Oh. One other. So one of the things that I found interesting was a comment that you made about not having a volume of with the language. So for instance, for English, for instance, we have voice-to-text translations on every single phone. And so that's based on millions and millions of hours and whatever. And I'm constantly calling my phone a racist because I know I articulate and I know there's nothing weird about how I speak, and yet it's always putting down words in a text that, because I have to do this sometimes in a car and I'm talking to it, and then when I go back and look at what it's written, I'm horrified sometimes because it's making me sound like I'm an idiot, which sometimes maybe. So how do you get around that?
Sure. That's an excellent question. I think that is something that we'll have to look at later down the line. And, if we're not quite there in terms of like integrating the text or the speech to text, or vice versa. We're not really at that point yet. I think an important consideration too is the way that our new speakers talk is a little bit different. And when you do language revitalization or rejuvenation, whichever term, the new sort of dialect that emerges of the language is probably going to be different from the older version. So we need to look at that too. Like when younger speakers, like my friend Faithlin, right, who was an immersion cohort graduate, when she speaks, she obviously is very good with the language, but maybe her intonation is different, maybe her prosody is a little bit different. Maybe because she's learning from a bunch of different elders that they all speak differently, she's incorporated versions of their individual ways of speaking. So yeah, it's yet to be seen, like, how does it handle that? And that's something that we'll see, maybe next year's conference, we'll have that information.
One last thing with the transcription itself. So humans will misspell words. And I don't know how this machine might do that. I know I was teaching my daughter a story, and I got to this one word. It was just a one-syllable word. And because I'm reading it, I'm reading it as it's written, and I'm not really paying attention to what is the context. And I got to this word, and I went, I have no idea what this word is. And I asked, and I said it precisely the way it was written. No older person older than I knew what it was either. And finally, I realized it was a misspelling of the word boat in the language.
Yeah.
Only when I put it back in context.
Sure.
So that happens all the time. I'm constantly finding errors in our dictionary where it's just typo, and then people read it as it's written and they think that's how it's supposed to be spoken.
Right.
So with the transcription, how do you get around something being misspelled other than hours of checking?
Exactly, and that's I think why it took us longer on the quote unquote more difficult speakers, because the ASR itself didn't handle them as well and maybe had more spelling errors. And so on our end, when we were going through and basically spell checking it, I remember sometimes there were words I was like, what is, I have no idea what that is. And it took me a couple minutes to figure it out, which is probably why it actually slowed us down a little bit in those cases. So that is a really good consideration too. Yeah, and also what counts as spelled correctly, because we have different diacritic markings, we have nasalization, we have accents, and so is it spelled wrong or right? I mean, it's important to have those. It changes the meaning of the word. So yeah, that's a really good question.
Last question.
Oh, sure.
When those corrections are made, they get plugged back into that is taught correctly the next time. Is it adapted?
It's not, and that is, that is something that somebody who is more computer brained than I could talk about. That's probably possible, like to have an adaptive model like that. I'm not sure. I think I'd like to retrain the model, maybe using some more hours of audio too to see if that helps. But I'm gonna write that down because that's a great question. Because if we could create a feedback loop of just improving, that would be really useful. So thank you.
Thank you.